This is The Metro. I'm Tia Graham. Now, you've heard about it. You probably think you understand what's going on with incel culture. Maybe you picture men with extreme ideologies about women. Maybe you picture violence. And you wouldn't be entirely wrong. But did you know that the word incel didn't start that way? It began in 1997 in a small online forum built by a young woman who was tired of feeling like she was the only one struggling to find love and connection. She called it Alana's Involuntary Celibacy Project. It was open to anyone, men, women, all backgrounds. A friendly place by her own description. A couple even met and got married there. And she stepped away in 2000, and the word she created took its original meaning and flipped it on its head. So how does a term born out of compassion become a banner for some of the most dangerous ideologies circulating online today? When did loneliness curdle into something this destructive? What does it say about the mental state of the people who participate in it? Dr. Julia DeCook is a researcher and former professor of advocacy and social change at Loyola University Chicago, and one of the leading academic voices on misogynistic incel communities and male supremacy. Dr. DeCook, welcome to the Metro.
Great, thanks. I'm happy to be here.
Of course. So, Julia, the word incel shows up constantly in news coverage, usually attached to violence or the makeup of a particular person. Before we get to the real origins of the word, what does it mean and how is it being used today?
Yeah, I think you set it up really nicely. So Incel stands for involuntary celibate. And while it was originally created as like a community to support other folks who were seeking out relationships but couldn't for whatever reason, it definitely changed meaning throughout the years and has kind of come to sort of represent this deeply misogynistic, like anti-feminist sort of community where it's predominantly boys and men who gather in these online spaces and spread misogynistic beliefs, but also do still use it as a kind of support forum. And so I think what's really interesting is when you look at incel forums, while you do see a lot of content that could be violent or deeply misogynistic, a lot of it is also just kind of like talking about video games and like sharing recipes. There's a little bit of like that everydayness to it that I think takes people aback sometimes.
Yes, and you use the term misogynistic incels to refer to the community that is commonly referred to as just incels in your research. And that's a deliberate choice. Why make that distinction?
Yeah, I think that distinction is made among some researchers who study incel communities, misogynistic incel communities, correcting myself, but it is easier just to use the shorthand, right?
Yeah.
And I think we make that distinction to sort of honor Alana's original goals of starting that community back in 1997, right? And I think it also pushes back against the idea that only men can be incels, which is a belief that is spread in these current manifestations of like these misogynistic incel communities where they push back against the idea that like women can have these struggles too. And so I think like having that distinction also calls out like what the actual concern or things that we should sort of focus on is the misogyny of it, right? And so I think it's like, can you be an incel and not be misogynistic in this current day and age and the way that the community looks? Perhaps not. But it also sort of like kind of calls out again like the piece of it that we should focus on, and that is the misogyny.
Yes. Now, let's talk about the real origins. You brought it up a little bit, and we talked about it in the intro as well, but most people would be surprised to learn that the word incel wasn't coined by an angry man that we may think it was coined by. Can you walk us through where it came from, actually?
Yeah, so it did start in that forum that you mentioned that Alana started, and it was kind of like you mentioned, like a place for people to sort of, have a safe space to share about like maybe why they hadn't yet had a sexual or romantic relationship, to kind of like share support. It was kind of like a Lonely Hearts Club sort of thing, but not necessarily in the way where they were like seeking each other out to like date each other, but kind of just more of like a support space. And I can't say for certainty like where that like jump occurred, where like that term was what we know today, but the original like goal of that forum was to be like a support space, and not necessarily even support in the way of like giving each other advice, but sometimes like you just need a place to vent that feels a little bit more supportive and safe. And some people may not have felt like they could share this kind of information with their friends and family in real life. And I think that's where like forums really became a very important piece of online communities, especially when they were first kind of taking off in the 90s and early 2000s.
Yeah, that .com boom.
Yeah.
Julia, at what point did the culture of these communities shift? What were the conditions that made these communities grow, not just in members, but the adopting of extreme ideologies?
It's hard to say, right? And I think it's really, and I think that's what makes it really hard about like
Yeah.
studying any kind of like internet history is like, even if like, people claim or you think that you've found like the point in time where this like jump occurred, it's like it's really hard to say for certainty, right? With any kind of certainty. And I think the other issue too is like, sometimes like, what if the original place where it did jump off, like it no longer exists, like you can't access it anymore. But I think like we really saw sort of like the big jump, I would say, like sort of happening in like the mid 2000s, where we sort of started seeing that shift from, like the .com era of the
Yeah.
internet, where like, you had to like know the URL and like
Yeah.
bookmark places and stuff to like find websites, with like platformed internet. And so like we started seeing like a centralization of online communities as opposed to like the diffused online space that we had grown accustomed to. And so, the rise of like, platforms like Facebook and even like MySpace and like even like, early blog sites and stuff like that, where this like centralization started occurring, I think is where we start seeing this shift occur.
Now, Julia, because we talked a little bit, there's not a place or a point in time that we can actually pinpoint directly when we started to see this shift, but there is a moment where we start to see, I guess you can say, a change in attitude towards women, I guess you can say it in that way. In 2009, PUA which stands for Pickup Artist Hate, launched as a consumer complaint forum for men who felt scammed by dating gurus. The men not only became angry with dating gurus, but also with women and the larger society. The misogynistic incel movement grew out of this. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, the definition of a pickup artist, also known as an alpha male, is a male supremacist community of heterosexual men who share predatory and coercive strategies aimed at manipulating women into sex. Now, Julia, can you walk us through that connection? How does a man go from feeling ripped off by a self-help guru to blaming women for his life problems?
Yeah, I think you call out the pickup artist community in a really important way. And so I don't know if like folks listening remember, or if you remember on VH1, there used to be that show, The Pickup Artist. It was like a
Yes.
reality series, and that was in the mid 2000s. He had that crazy hat. I think his name was Mystery.
Yes.
Um, but obviously, like pickup artist, like communities, not communities, but like pickup artists who like sold their classes to men who were struggling to have relationships with women. Like they'd existed for a little while leading
Yeah.
up to that, but then the forum started, and I think there was this really big like resurgence of like the pickup artists, like coaching and classes and things like that. And
Yeah.
obviously, they went from being like, consumer complaints where they felt like ripped off by the class or didn't feel that they got what they were promised. And at the but at the core of it, again, is like, and that's why we have that like misogynistic incel, that
Yes.
we call out the misogyny of it, is that, the reason why they may have been struggling to, have relationships or even just like date women and stuff like that, like may not have had to do anything with their techniques, but
Wow.
rather like their beliefs and attitudes towards women. And I think these forums then became sort of like this like festering ground for men to start kind of like coming to them. And like it started with like complaining about pickup artists, and like the pickup artist classes, and then it just kind of like devolved into, well, like I've done everything that I could do, I even
Yeah.
went to this class, I've used the techniques, and surely there's nothing wrong with me, but rather that it's the women who are the problem. And that like is kind of how it snowballed.
And Julia, as we're chatting and as we're talking about pickup artists and the culture that it was, I think about the film Hitch with Will Smith and Eva Mendes and how that truly was a pickup artist film. It talked about men getting help from a dating coach, and this coach would help them find the women of their dreams. And if it didn't work out for them, it was kind of an oh well situation. So I just think about how it's lived within our mainstream media.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's like, dating coaches still exist. And I think like some of them are good, some of them aren't. But like, the one thing that they always like have as a disclaimer is that I can teach you these methods, but at the end of the day, like it's up to you, right?
Mm,
And I think that's with like any kind of like coaching service that you pursue, like career or whatever.
yeah. This is the Metro. I'm Tia Graham. We're talking about misogynistic incel culture. My guest is Dr. Julia DeCook, a researcher and former professor of advocacy and social change at Loyola University, Chicago, and is one of the leading academic voices of misogynistic incel communities and male supremacy. Now, I want to discuss how the incel term became associated with violence. Now, let's talk about a pair of tragic incidents that have occurred in the last 15 years that were born out of this ideology. And a quick warning to our listeners, we're about to talk about gun violence. We will not be naming the shooter in order to avoid granting them notoriety. On May 23rd, 2014, a man shot and killed 6 people near UC Santa Barbara. Before the attack, he uploaded a video and a 137-page manifesto. He never actually used the word incel to describe himself, but within days of the attack, major outlets like the Washington Post were using it as a shorthand for a kind of dangerous, violent male extremism. He was, however, a part of the greater pickup artist community. So since then, that framing has largely stuck. Looking back, did journalism get the 2014 story right? And this is for you, Dr. DeCook.
I'm pausing because I'm trying to think about
Oh,
I think
yes.
yeah, and I think, the Isla Vista shooting, I think was sort of this like inflection point about like, can these forums lead to violence is sort of
Mm,
like that reckoning that we had to face. And I think the shorthand of using incel, like I don't necessarily think was incorrect, even
mm,
though the shooter himself did not identify with that label. Like he was involved in the PUA hate forum.
mm.
And was sort of like, people found like posts of his from like some like weightlifting forum and stuff like that
Yes.
too. And I think at the end of the day, like whether or not he identified as an incel, I think is sort of like irrelevant, but rather like the way that he sort of became this like cult figure within incel communities, I think is something that warrants like further investigation, and like I think is the thing that we should sort of index on. And I think another thing that I wanted to sort of point out is that like obviously like violent attacks against women based in this sort of like misogynistic anti-feminist ideology. I think one of the most significant ones happened in 1989 in Montreal, where a shooter entered a university, specifically went into engineering classes, and he shot 28 people, 24 of whom were women, and killed, I think, 14 of them.
Mm,
And, there was no forum back then, right? But and no online spaces that like, sort of we think like influence the Isla Vista shooters. But I think like also too, the Isla Vista shooter, it's like really unclear if that ideology was fomented within those spaces, right?
yeah.
And I think like at the end of the day, when his YouTube channel was up for quite a long time after the shooting.
Mm,
And when you look at his videos, you read the manifesto, it's really clear that this is like a viewpoint and like perspective and like ideology that he had that like it's really hard to I think like pin down the causality of it. And I think like the way that the media reported on it too, it's sort of sensationalized like the
mm-hmm.
incel piece of it, right? And I think when we sort of like focus on like the incel piece, we sort of kind of like shoo away, I think, like the hard confrontation and like realization that like this was a very misogynistic young man who carried out like a really horrifying act of violence. And we sort of kind of make it an issue about mental health
Yeah.
as opposed to kind of like, okay, but what were the conditions that sort of like led him to believe that this would be the right action to take? And I think like that requires a little bit of a like difficult like introspection for us as a society and a culture about like, why did this happen? And it's easier to kind of like, blame the individual as opposed to look at sort of like the societal structure around it.
Mm. Julia, the shooter that we're referring to back in 2014 became a martyr inside these communities almost immediately. So 4 years later, it's another attack that happened in Toronto. The man behind the wheel didn't arrive at that moment alone. Alana, the woman who first coined the term, spoke with the BBC after the Toronto van attack in 2018. And she said she was upset the word had changed meanings. And then essentially she said he had let it go completely. That attack killed 10 people and injured 15 more when a 25-year-old man drove a van into pedestrians. Before he did, he posted online invoking the previous shooter in 2014 and declaring, quote, "The Incel rebellion has already begun." Now, Alana had already let that word go, but the people who took it over and built an entire identity continued it. As a researcher who had been studying this for years, what stood out to you about this particular manifesto and how important of a moment was it for your work going forward?
I think it's less about the in the spaces where we study this. I think some folks, there was a debate on whether or not like that manifesto was even written by him.
Oh, okay.
And so I think that's like a separate conversation that we can dive deeper into maybe some other time. But I think one thing that sort of stands out about the Toronto van attack is that it's sort of the Isla Vista shooting happened in 2014, right?
Yes.
But then I think the 2018 Toronto van attack is when I think people really started paying attention to these communities
Yeah.
and like started treating them as, they call them like gateway ideologies into extremism, or like gateway communities into extremism. There was a lot of interest at this time around like misinformation and extremism, and especially around like far right extremism. Especially after the 2016 election, and like I think all the events leading up to it, and the role that online communities may have played in like the proliferation of these sorts of extremist ideologies. And so I think the Toronto van attack is when, in my view, is when like I think like incels and like misogynistic communities really entered, I think, like the public consciousness in a very real way, but also in academia as well. I
Yes.
think like before that, obviously there was research about the Isla Vista shooter and like the Montreal shooter that I've mentioned, and other acts of violence against women, of course. But I think it kind of went from being this sort of like niche research area to something that like a lot of people latched onto and were like, clearly it's these forums that are causing young men to like carry out these attacks. And I think that was just kind of like a piece of this like growing interest in the role that online communities play in creating and spreading like extremist ideology, because of like the social, political, cultural moment that we were in.
Julia, now you said mental health is not the main takeaway here. How much of the loneliness that these communities exist plays a role here?
Yeah, I think that's a really good call out. And I'd also really like to make it very clear that I am not a
Oh,
psychologist.
yes.
But I think the reason why I call that out specifically is because the point that I made, where I think if there's an overemphasis on like the mental health piece of it, and there have been attempts to like, propose that if young boys and men who are a part of these forums just got the right kind of therapy, or like even got a girlfriend, or just like got off of these forums, like that would cure them of these beliefs, right? And I think it's really important that we're very careful in the way that, again, we like individualize the problem, where like there's going to be some like magic cure to like cure these men of their misogynistic beliefs, and that's just simply not true, right? And I think the push to also say like, oh, like if we just help them get a girlfriend, like they'll be fine, they'll be cured of their misogyny, is kind of the approach that we have there. But then what if they start being abusive, or like just treat their girlfriends horribly? That doesn't cure them of their misogyny, it just gives them another thing to kind of like project their belief system onto, right? And there's been studies that have found too that a lot of boys and men who are a part of these forums, like they reject therapy. They don't believe that it will fix them. They also see therapy as like a very feminine practice that like isn't going to do anything to like solve their problems, but can actually rather make them worse. And so I think that's why like the mental health piece of it and like the loneliness piece of it, there are plenty of people who are lonely who don't develop extremely hateful beliefs, right? And I think the over indexing on the mental health piece of it like individualizes the problem as something that like can have a cure and a solution.
This is The Metro. I'm Tia Graham. My guest is Dr. Julia DeCook, a former professor at Loyola University and an expert researcher. When we return, we will continue our conversation about the co-opting of the term incel and how the groups thrive in our society and the role it's had in the growth of the extremist movements. You all stay right there. We'll be right back. This is The Metro. This is The Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Tia Graham. We've been tracing how the words incel got taken and turned into something almost unrecognizable from where it started. Dr. Julia DeCook is a researcher and former professor of advocacy and social change at Loyola University, Chicago, and one of the leading academic voices on misogynistic incel communities and male supremacy. Now, Julia, misogynistic incel culture, which was born from a community of heterosexual men who could not find partners and feel like they were being punished. Now, that mindset has spread to the mainstream. What does that look like in everyday life?
Yeah, I think the mainstreaming of this sort of ideology, it shows up not just in the terms that I think have like leaked out from these forums. So
Yeah.
like even like looks maxing, or like people have started adding maxing to the end of everything, that did come from these forums. And like, not to say that anybody who uses that is automatically an incel, but I think like the language has definitely seeped out. I think, obviously the growth of there's no I don't think there's like a perfect word for it, but I think the shorthand of it is podcast bros, men who have podcasts who spread ideas and beliefs around like, how women should be more submissive and like take on more traditional gender roles, who push for that sort of like belief system where, feminism has lied to women. Like this kind of like universe of content has definitely like taken off in the past few years. And like there's even like a lot of like very large TikTok accounts, Instagram accounts where they push this sort of belief system. And I think like the mainstreaming of it comes not just like in the language that has like come out of these forums, but also I think like the way that all of these other social media platforms like support this type of content, even though they may not be like explicitly incel, but like they do spread a lot of these similar types of beliefs.
Wow. Now, Julia, Movember, the Men's Health Organization, surveyed over 3,000 young men across the U.S., UK, and Australia about their consumption of online masculinity content. The fitness coaches, the finance gurus, like you said, the podcast bros, 2/3 are watching it regularly. 2/3. They call it motivating and inspiring. And yet, compared to young men who don't watch it, they report worse mental health, less willingness to seek help, and more negative attitude towards women. But optimistic and psychologically distressed at the same time, which are just two polar opposites, the content that promises to make men stronger is also making them have poor self-esteem and low self-value. At what point, Julia, does self-improvement content become something more sinister?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I think, like you said, the fact that like it makes them feel optimistic, but also like, puts them into this pit of despair at the same time. I
Yes.
think these are two like incredibly conflicting sets of emotions, right? And I think it's not unique to men either, right? Like
No.
boys and men aren't the only type that are being exposed to this content. And like, girls and women also have that same sort of like dichotomy of like complex emotions where it is like inspiring and like, motivational, but also it makes them feel worse about themselves, right? Because try as one might, like there's things that prevent them from like having the perfect body, from like having the perfect life. And I think like those conflicting emotions, I think, are just sort of a product of like the current social media landscape. And I think inspirational content, it reaches a lot of people. I think like there's this greater movement in society around like self-improvement and like being the best version of yourself. And for women specifically, right? It's
Yes.
like Pilates, matcha, bullet journaling, and that sort of thing, right? But I think for men, it's similar. It's gym. It's like meal planning. It's like being stoic, like being a man. And I
Yes.
think it's that type of content does really well on social media because it is aspirational,
Mm.
and because it is aspirational, it's not necessarily always meant to be achieved. And I think that's where that like difficult set of emotions sort of come in where, like, I continue consuming this because I do find it inspiring, but then because I can't achieve the things that like the person making the content has is like showing to me, and obviously like nobody shows like bad things on social media, right? That doesn't
No,
do well.
exactly.
um I think it just like kind of like reinforces like that feeling of like not ever being good enough.
Julia, one thing that strikes me when reading your research is that these communities seem to offer men permission to feel things you are allowed to feel in these spaces. However, it's usually rage or humiliation or grief about rejection, things that mainstream masculine culture tells them they should not feel. Is the ideology the problem, or is the ideology filling a void that the culture at large created?
I think it can be both, and I think that's a really important call out that you made about like, culturally, boys and men are not encouraged to show emotions that are seen as being too feminine, and like,
Yes.
often a lot of feminist scholars and stuff like that have pointed out that the only acceptable emotion for boys and men to express is like aggression and like anger. I think people take violence, like men being violent as this sort of like fixed male destiny, but there is nothing that makes boys and men biologically more violent. It's like it's a kind of like violence is a very complex set of like is impacted by a very complex set of factors, and that is a disservice to men, right? Because then they never feel that they're able to like express their emotions, to like seek help, that they like can't express like sadness or grief in a way that doesn't automatically also turn into like rage or anger. And I think it's like, the lack of like emotional regulation, the lack of like feeling safe to like express like an emotion that is negative but not necessarily violent, right? That is a massive disservice to boys and men that like is still continuing in like our current culture.
Dr. DeCook, after everything you've studied, everything you've read, everything you know about how deep this runs, is this thing actually fixable?
I think that's a really hard question. And I
Yeah.
think like the point that I made is that, I'm not a psychologist. I think like, and I pointed out too that focusing too much on individual
Hmm.
solutions, like is not necessarily going to solve like the core of the problem, right? But then, how do we like have this like massive societal and cultural shift towards like understanding how to better support boys and men, and to like, point out the fact that patriarchy doesn't just hurt women, it also hurts men, because like patriarchy is a system that encourages them to only express their emotions through violence and not through like other healthier means. I don't want to say that it's hopeless, but I do want to say that there is no one size fits all solution. And especially when we take into account like other socio-demographic variables such as like race and class, it gets even more complex. And I think really what we have to do is like look at ourselves and our communities to see how we reinforce these types of ideas and stereotypes. And that's a really uncomfortable thing to do. And I think what makes it feel solvable is being able to envision and realize a world that has more care and more nurturing and more cooperation, regardless of someone's gender. And like, all of these things are based on the set of belief that these traits aren't gendered. And, pointing out to a lot of research points out too that like, peers and friend groups like have a major impact on the socialization of these attitudes and the hardening of these beliefs, right? And so I think one of the first steps too is to surround yourself with people who like care and nurture and encourage, as opposed to like in a way that is like moving towards like a healthier direction, that rather than encouraging like hateful like rage filled beliefs. And obviously social media like just amplifies what's happening in the real world. It's sort of like a magnifying mirror that can also distort and distract us. And so while these aren't like solutions per se, I think it's still, I think we should all remain optimistic that we can move towards something better, because I think like the hope is the most important piece there.
Now, Julia, you mentioned, of course, the importance of emotional literacy for young men, the ability to name and process feelings that masculine culture tells them are weaknesses. We just talked about that briefly. Do you think or believe that it's teachable? And if so, who teaches this?
Oh yeah, I think it's absolutely teachable, because I think uh, it's not that young girls like aren't taught this; they're
Yeah.
just taught it more,
Yep.
right? And I think like this. kind of like cultural belief of like, boys will be boys, it like sort of naturalizes like that sort of behavior. And also it kind of like immediately approaches boys, I'm going to say, from this like deficit perspective, where they're just like simply not as capable as girls as learning this, but they absolutely are. And so I think it's like focusing on teaching emotional literacy and emotional regulation, and even like us ourselves as the adults in the room, right? Like if we find ourselves like reinforcing a gender stereotype, like taking a beat and thinking like, why do I believe this? Like, why am I pushing this? Like, why am I discouraging this like young child from playing with a stuffed animal as opposed to a truck, right? And so I think it's like socialization like comes first from the adults around the children, and I think obviously children influence each other, but I think like it's absolutely teachable, and I think there should be more of a less of a deficit perspective and more of like the sort of like regardless of the child's gender, like that they can learn these skills.
And Julia, if the mainstreaming of misogyny is the disease, what does a healthier masculinity actually look like? What are we trying to build toward?
That's a good question. I think toxic masculinity is thrown around a lot as a term without people really stopping to think about what it means.
Exactly.
And Carol Harrington, the feminist scholar, actually argues that individualizing like a toxic healthy binary actually serves to reproduce gender hierarchies.
Wow.
And again, it also sort of pathologizes misogyny and toxic masculinity as a thing that has a cure. But I think like toxic versus healthy masculinity itself is sort of a limited framework because it still approaches men from this deficit perspective, or that like, if they do X, Y, and Z, they will be a quote unquote good man. But I think reducing it down to like bad and good, or like toxic and healthy, I think it still kind of reinforces that idea. It's just that some men need to be fixed rather than looking at these issues as like a larger systemic problem.
Now, last thing, briefly, you've spent years studying the darkest corners of this. What gives you hope?
I think what gives me hope is seeing how other people use online communities as spaces of like hope and nurture and care. And I think also too, like there are men who are pushing back against this or like trying their best to. And I think it's a really easy space to feel hopeless in, but I think the thing that gives people hope who are in these like research fields and things like that,
Yes.
who study these sorts of problems, is that the belief that like I think humans are inherently good. Um, and I think like it's kind of like holding on to that belief that like there is like I think a hope for humanity more broadly. Um, I think is what kind of like helps people keep going. But like, how do we like realize like a better future is sort of like the greater mission that I think a lot of people are more aligned to.
Dr. Julia DeCook is a researcher and former professor of advocacy and social change at Loyola University Chicago, and one of the leading academic voices on misogynistic incel communities and male supremacy. Her research, including the policy brief on misogynistic incels, co-authored with Megyn Kelly and Alex DeBronco, is available through the New America Foundation. We'll have a link at wdet.org. Dr. DeCook, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That's it for the show. The Metro is hosted by Robin Vincent and me, Tia Graham. It's produced by Sam Corey and Carrie Jr. II. Our engineer is Jose Llanes, and our senior producer is David Lyons. The Metro is a production of WDET, a listener-supported service of Wayne State University. And this is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation. You all have a great day.